From the Keyforge rulebook, chains represent supernatural bindings that are occasionally placed onto specific archons by the architects, sometimes in an effort to better challenge the archon to grow and overcome greater adversity, and other times to penalize the archon for breaking a rule or piece of crucible etiquette. Chains are a unique mechanic as far as competitive card games go. It's also one of the more foreign-seeming ones in the game. It sometimes feels that so many and yet so few people are comfortable with the chain mechanic. People's experiences with chains will vary greatly, whether you're playing at vault tours, local weekly events, or just tabletop with a friend. I'm Keyforge Concepts, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about chains, how they affect play, and what types of decks thrive or struggle being chained. First, let's talk about how chains work. Chains exist to limit your maximum hand size, and thus reduce the number of resources you have in your hand at any given time. Chains can be obtained through enemy card effects like Binding Irons, or through friendly card effects like Axiom of Grisk, as a way to balance out a powerful card. Decks can also accumulate chains by performing well in weekly chain-bound events at your local game store, or can be assigned during friendly play in an effort to balance out a particular deck matchup. Here we have a chain tracker, the one that is included in most of the starter sets for the game. On the card, you will see the numbers in the center. These are the number of chains your deck currently has. This is kept track of by the ring. For example, this tracker indicates that the player currently has 6 chains. The number on the right indicates the hand penalty you will receive from having said amount of chains. Because this player is at 6 chains, they will have a hand penalty of -1. Each time, including during setup, a player with 1 or more chains would draw 1 or more cards to refill their hand. That player draws fewer cards based on their current chain level, and then sheds 1 chain by reducing their chain tracker by 1. Now that we all understand how chains work, let's talk about how they actually impact the game. The biggest and most obvious repercussion of chains is that you have less cards in your hand. In previous videos, I have stressed the importance of hand composition and cycling, and having less resources in your hand is going to limit your ability to do this. You might have less cards to play from hand, which means you're going to draw a little bit slower, you're going to be getting on board and generate amber a little bit slower, and it'll be less likely that you have that all-important board clear or amber control card when you need it later. Chains most likely won't completely neutralize your deck all game, but they will limit your efficiency and potential, which fits in thematically with exactly what they should be doing. This slowdown is most relevant in the game at the very beginning. If you're starting a game with chains, naturally they're going to affect your starting draw and any potential mulligans as well. We dove into the math behind opening hands and mulligans in detail in one of my previous videos. I'll leave a link in the corner as well as in the description below. Without getting into heavy numbers, my overall findings were that as your hand size decreases, the average quality of your starting hand will also decrease. In particular, this is referring to the house composition of your starting hand. Good starting hand composition typically has a lot of cards from a single house, enabling you to play them all in one turn, and therefore draw more at the end of your turn, cycling through your deck quicker. Going second in game with chains and having a starting hand of 5 is very lackluster compared to the average 3 cards you're getting from a hand of 6. If you decide to mulligan and end up with a starting hand of 4, things look even worse. Before I continue, I'd like to give a shout out and a big thanks to blinkingline from Archon Arcana for saving the day here. If you recall, blinkingline is the one who originally compiled the probabilities for starting hand house composition, the ones that I referenced specifically in my mulligans in math video. I reached out to them, and they were kind enough to take the time out of their day to explain the math and walk me through it, as well as help calculate the odds for a starting hand of 4. Archon Arcana is a wiki created by members of the Keyforge community and is an amazing resource that I use personally. On the site, you can find card lists, new player resources, and even things like rulings for specific cards and card erratas. So once again, a big thanks to blinkingline. You can find Archon Arcana at archonarcana.com. I'll also leave a link in the description below. If you take a chained mulligan and go down to a starting hand of 4, you only have just under a 30% chance of having 3 or more cards of one house. The other 70% of the time, you're only going to have a max 2 cards from a single house, with an almost 50% chance overall of drawing the statistically worst house combination of 2-1-1. It's pretty bad. When you also factor in the likelihood of being chained for at least a few more turns, ensuring that you get off to a solid start is that much more important. For these reasons, when I start a game with chains, I often prefer going first. Starting a game with 6 cards instead of 5 is obviously ideal, but in case I do draw into a bad starting hand, I don't feel nearly as bad taking a mulligan down to 5 than I would taking a mulligan down to 4. Even if I only get to play 1 card that first turn, the chain doesn't feel nearly as impactful to me. And after playing that 1 card, 2 chains are already gone, 1 from the initial draw of the game, and 1 from ending your turn. Other players may have different opinions on this. This is just an observation taken from my own experiences starting games with chains. If players aren't using decks that are already chained, players are gaining chains as drawbacks to powerful card effects. Most of these are attached to board clears such as Gateway to Dis and Kurzap, or other powerful effects like Effervescent Principle. And in these cases, chains are used as a mechanic to balance these incredibly powerful card effects, and I think it's brilliant. Thematically, these cards represent a huge burst in power by your Archon, so powerful that they suffer a temporary recoil from using their abilities like this. From a more practical gameplay standpoint, these are all very huge momentum-changing cards that can often be leveraged in your favor. Instead of blindly playing these cards without repercussion, players need to decide if using the card is worth that trade-off of having a smaller hand for a few turns after. Even if you don't use these cards on your turn, is it worth saving that card in your hand? Or do you decide to discard it to open up more draw space? Not only does it create subtle points of decision making for a player, but it also allows the development team to create these cards in the first place. All of these cards would be much too powerful without the downside of gaining chains. This gives the game designers more flexibility in designing cards, knowing that they can still create powerful cards by assigning chains to their use. Now, all this being said, keep in mind that most of the time players will not find themselves with copious amounts of chains. In my experience playing weeklies and casual with friends, I've only ever found myself with over 7 chains when my opponent is playing Binding Irons against me, or if I'm playing in a chain bidding format such as Adaptive Short. The magic number for me with most decks is 4. I find that playing with 3 chains or less doesn't severely hinder me most of the time, especially if I'm playing a deck that has a few strong first turn plays. Once I hit 4 chains and beyond is when I really start to feel the card disadvantage accumulate. Even if I get off to a strong start, refilling 1 less card in hand for 3 turns after the initial draw will slow me down enough to give my opponent a chance to take control. This is Keyforge, however, so we know that there are always exceptions. On October 17, 2019, Fantasy Flight published an article on their website entitled The Master of Chains. This article is an interview with player Ryan Rolston and his legendary deck Elder Hedgebet Haas, which not only did well enough to be permanently retired from chainbound events, but also holds the record for the deck with the most chains in the world, sitting at a mind-boggling 21 chains. If you recall our chain tracker from before, that means when Ryan was at 19 chains with this deck, he was regularly drawing starting hands of only 2 cards. If he wanted to, he could take a mulligan and have a starting hand of just 1 card. Despite this incredibly severe handicap, Ryan was still able to perform and remain competitive with this deck over an extended period of time. We all know in Keyforge that decks are not made equally. But how could a deck be able to overcome such crippling chains? The truth is that while some decks are heavily impacted by chains, others are still able to perform at reasonable levels and not be weighed down by the card disadvantage. So let's talk about what types of deck deal well with chains and which don't. The biggest factor and indicator that a deck will still perform fairly well with chains is the speed or efficiency of a deck. Specifically, I'm talking about decks with a lot of draw, archive, discard, and house cheat effects. When you think about it, it makes sense. The biggest drawback to having chains is that you're decreasing the speed and efficiency of your deck. You're drawing less cards and you're cycling slower. But if you have a deck that already excels in this area, then they will naturally have the tools to offset having less overall resources in your hand. In the case of Elder Hedgebet Haas, the speed and efficiency of this deck is what allowed it to still perform so consistently, particularly in Logos with the plethora of archive and draw effects. Now, I don't like using stats from decks of Keyforge as hard facts, but according to the site, this deck was within the top 1% of decks with efficiency, with a score of 28. Undoubtedly, this was a blazingly fast deck. If you haven't noticed already, this deck is actually a GenKa deck, which refers to the card combination of Martian Generosity and Key Abduction to draw a large chunk of your deck and potentially cheat out free keys. I suspect that having 2 copies of Martian Generosity is the most important aspect of this deck, and attributes a lot to its high efficiency rating. If you already have a few Amber in your pool, you can play one to overcome the hand limitation of your chains, and then have the other one to cycle your deck even further down the line. Being able to forge multiple keys for free also helps this deck in this regard, since it's much more efficient than having to build up the Amber yourself. Regardless, any deck that has high draw or archiving power will do generally well even when chained. One more underrated aspect about this deck is that it has a few ways to house cheat, particularly in House Sanctum. Ryan actually talks about this in his interview. He says that, beyond that, I think my favorite part about the deck, especially with heavy chains, is that there is a lot more strategy to it than just do the combo and win. In particular, I found cards like Golden Aura, Smite, and Grey Rider let me do things I wasn't supposed to do that turn, like unstun and fight with Zorg, throw Hexbion at something to pseudo-draw a card, stuff like that. Was really fun to discover once the deck slowed down a little with all the chains. So as we can see, the flexibility in being able to use different options within a different house turn is very valuable in making the most out of the resources you have available. Even if you aren't running a GenKa deck specifically, any deck that runs and plays itself efficiently will find itself not being dragged down by being chained too much. The second big thing that a deck needs to perform well with chains is having outs, or more simply put, cards that buy you time. These could be cards that board clear or otherwise serve as creature control, or amber control cards to help take your opponent off of check and buy you an extra turn. Especially operating with a card disadvantage, having multiple outs within a deck will greatly increase the consistency of which you draw into these cards. For Elder Hedgebet Haas, this comes mostly in the form of amber control cards, with things like Doorstep to Heaven, Nizik Resonator, and Obad the Grim usually being able to take someone out of check. There are also tools like Blinding Light and Radiant Truth that can greatly slow down a board with stuns, once again buying some valuable time for its archiving and draw to kick in. Even cards like Stormcrawler or Zorg can become huge pains for an opponent who allows themselves to be stunned numerous times. These two things are what I believe to be the most important aspects of a deck that performs well with chains. If you pull a deck that is efficient and has the tools to stall or get out of multiple situations, then most likely your deck will not be as affected by being chained. There are some other things that can also help a chained deck. The first one would be having high amber generation, especially if you're playing a deck with no way to easily key cheat. The faster you're able to generate the amber, the better. Speaking of key cheats can also be beneficial to a chain deck. As we saw with Elder Haas, having a key cheat can potentially reduce the amount of work and amber you need to generate and win the game, especially if you're able to forge for free with a key cheat such as Key Abduction. Now, you might be saying, I'm pretty sure you're just listing things that make a deck good in general. And that's partially true. Generally, stronger decks will still be pretty strong, even if they do have chains. But I have played both with and against decks that are strong unchained, but cannot maintain the same level once they accumulate chains due to the low cycling power of the deck or lack of control options. These decks can still pull off dominating wins if their cards line up well, but their overall consistency becomes severely impacted by the card disadvantage. Chains serve to limit an Archon's power, restraining and holding it back from its full potential. And that's exactly what they do. We've seen that some archons rise up to the challenge, while others fall under the weight of the card disadvantage. Whether they're accumulated as a repercussion of powerful cards, or through sustained success in weekly tournaments, chains bring a simple yet effective point of balance to the game. Not only does it create room for powerful cards to exist, but it provides decks with longevity using a thematically sound mechanic. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Take care, and I will see you soon.